Hey guys, welcome to day 57 of 100 Days of Code. Today we're going to be digging deeper into building more advanced Flask applications. And in order to do that, we're going to be learning about URL building and templating with Jinja. So very often when you're creating a website, you'll get cases where you actually don't want to create the page entirely from scratch. For example, if you had a blog and you wanted to have several different posts in the blog, you don't want to create a separate HTML file for each blog post. So in that case, it's really helpful to have a templating language where you can replace bits of that blog with dynamic content. And that's where Jinja comes in. This is a templating language built for Python, and it's going to allow us to create the general layout of our blog, the styling and the structure, and then to replace the content, for example, the title or the subtitle or the body, with dynamic content that's generated each time we load a specific page. And by the end of today, you will have built a very simple blog with a number of blog posts. So here we can see the title and subtitle, and then when we click on read to see the blog post in detail, we go to a different page. And depending on which of these blog posts we've clicked on, you can see that we're rendering basically the same layout, the same styling, and the same structure, but each time for each of these pages, we're getting some different content. So that's the goal. And once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and we'll get started. Now, to begin, all we need is a simple Flask application. You can either write this out from scratch for practice, or you can head over to the course resources and you can download this file as a zip file. Once you've unzipped it and opened it in PyCharm, you should see a server.py file which contains all of the basic code that is required to render Hello World onto the screen. So if we go ahead and just run this file and go to the local URL of our website, you should just be able to see Hello World. Now, the next thing I want you to do is to create an HTML file, which you'll call index. And inside this HTML file, we're going to give it a title of just my website, and the more important part is going to occur in the body. For practice, go ahead and see if you can create an H1 that says Hello World instead of returning just Hello World as text, and render this index HTML onto the screen instead. Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. Alright, so the first thing we had to do was to create an H1 that said Hello World. And once we've created our index.html, we want to render it as a template instead of just returning this text. So to do that, we're going to need this render template function at the top. So we're going to say render template, and then the template we want to render is called index.html. But one thing you have to remember is that this file has to be inside a folder called templates, because Flask has specific requirements for things like static files and templates. So now we should be ready to rerun our app so that it'll take into account the new files, and then go to our website and you should see this Hello World is being rendered from our index.html. Now, one of the things you might be wondering is, why is this a template? Why are we rendering a template when in fact what we're doing is just sending over an HTML file? Well, the HTML files can actually act as a template as long as we know how to work with a templating language. The templating language that we're going to use is called Jinja, and this is specific for Python. It allows us to use some syntax like these curly braces, percentage signs, or double curly braces in order to specify inside the HTML file which parts should actually be evaluated as Python code. Let me show you something. We've already seen that just by putting this text in between the H1, we get this rendered as text in the H1. And if I go ahead and I wrote something like 5 times 6, well, what would you expect our website to look like? Well, if I go ahead and hit save And because we're in debug mode, then our server should allow us to refresh the page, and you see it's just the plain text of what I wrote right here. Now, however, if I go ahead and add 2 curly braces around this expression, then this now suddenly becomes evaluated as Python code. So let's hit save again, and let's hit refresh, and you can see now instead of 5*6, I get 30. So this is actually being seen as Python code, and the calculated outcome is being put into this H1. This is why this is known as a templating language, because it means that we can have an HTML which acts as the template, where the title doesn't change, the head doesn't change, the styling doesn't change, and only the parts which we specify inside these curly braces actually get evaluated as Python code and inserted into the template. I'm going to add back the hello world inside an H1, and also our Python expression inside this Jinja markup so that you can see both versions. The next thing I want to do is, what if I wanted to generate a random number? Let's say I was to create an H3, and inside here I wanted to generate a random number. How would I do that? Well, when we're working with something that requires an import, for example, to get a random number, we're going to need to import the random module, then it's best to write our code inside our Python server. Let me show you how this works. Let's go ahead and import random so that we can generate a random number. And I'm going to do that inside this home function. Now, in this case, I'm just going to generate a random number between 1 and 10. But the most important thing is I want to be able to send this random number over to my index.html and incorporate it into this template when I render it. So what I can do after the first parameter, which is the name of the template file, I can add as many keyword arguments as I need. If we take a look at this render template, you can see that after the name of the template, the next parameter has the double star context. This is basically the same as when you see the double star keyword arguments or quargs. Basically, it says that you can add as many keyword arguments as you want, and each of these keyword arguments need to have a name for the variable and a value for the variable. And the reason why they need to have a name and value is because we can refer to that variable by its name inside the templated HTML file. So for example, if I go ahead and send over a variable which I'll call num, and then set it equal to this random number we've generated here, well now, once this template gets rendered, it's going to pass over this variable with this name and with this value. So now in our index.html, I can tap into that variable name, which is num, and I can insert it using these double curly braces into the position that I want it to be. So that's going to go inside that H3. And now if I hit save and go ahead and refresh my website, you can see I've got this random number and then a number show up. And every time I hit refresh, you can see that number changes to a different random number between 1 and 10. So we've seen how we can render an HTML file just by using rendered template, but we've also seen that inside the template, we can use these double curly braces in order to create single lines of Python expressions, which can be evaluated and then inserted into the position that we desire. Now we've also seen that we can pass over any variable we desire as keyword arguments after the name of the template. So now I've got a challenge for you. On a lot of websites, for example, if you go to the Jinja website, which you'll find in the course resources, and you scroll to the very bottom, there's usually a line of copyright text. So it'll say copyright and the current year, and then the name of the creator or the company. Now that year is supposed to be the current year to say that this website's copyright is valid in this current year. But very often, even Jinja included, they don't actually update their footer because it's probably just some hard-coded text, as you can see right here. Now, this is something that annoys a lot of web developers and web designers. And they're outraged by the idea that people would have just some plain text as their copyright. We're programmers, right? We should be able to update our footer dynamically by using code. And this is a website which has a pretty much a sort of campaign against websites with outdated footers. And if you take a look at their footer, you can see that this is not just a piece of plain text. This is actually a script using JavaScript to work out the value of the current year. And so it's always going to be up to date no matter what year it is. So we also want to have a dynamic footer year. But we're not going to be doing it with JavaScript and definitely not with PHP. We're going to be doing it with Python. So this is the challenge for you. Using what you've learned in this lesson, see if you can create a footer element. So we can put it inside a footer tag like this. And inside this footer tag, I want you to create a paragraph element that can say any piece of text as long as it contains the copyright year, which should be the current year worked out programmatically using Python. Pause the video and have a think about how you might solve that challenge. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is create our paragraph, and we're going to say something like copyright and then the year, and then we're going to say something like built by. This is a pretty common footer. Now, what we want to do is we want to replace these YYYYYs with the actual year. So as you can imagine, I'm going to be using these double curly braces to insert the year into here. But first, I have to generate that. So going back to our server.py, I'm going to import the datetime module, which you've used many times before to generate the current date and time. And we're going to use it specifically this time, though, to generate the current year. And it's going to be done using the datetime module, the datetime class, and then we're going to call the now method in order to get the current datetime, and then we're going to tap into the year property. So now, in addition to passing over that random number as num, I'm also going to pass over a new variable with the name of year and the value of the current year that we just worked out from here. So now when this template is rendered, it's also going to receive a variable called year, which we can insert right here into the copyright like that. So now if I go ahead and hit save, go back to our website, hit refresh, you can see our footer show up, copyright 2020, which is the current year I'm living in, and it has the rest of the text. So now, no matter which year it is, we will never need to update our footer ever again because it's being automatically updated using code. Now that you've seen that we can write code in our server, work out some sort of value or get some piece of data, and then we can send it over to our template to be rendered, I've got a challenge for you to test some of the things that you've learned from previous days, as well as what we've been doing with Flask over the last few days. I found a pretty interesting API called Ageify, and there's also Genderize. This is a really simple API. It doesn't require you to sign up, and it doesn't require any authentication. What you can do with it is you can hit up the URL of the API, and then you can pass over a value for name, and it's going to predict the age of a name. You can go ahead and hit try me to see what you get. You can see it's a very simple JSON that you get back, and this describes the name that you entered, the estimated age of that person with that name, and also how many times they've sampled this name when they were calculating this data. Now, another one is Genderize, where you can pass in a name and it'll give you the predicted gender. So I have to say from testing that I think Genderize is a lot more accurate than Ageify, but maybe I'm just a little bit upset because it says that people with my name on average are 63 years old. But hey, I'm doing pretty well for a 63-year-old, so I can't complain. Now, what I want you to do is to turn this into a dynamic Flask application. We're going to set up a new route in our application, and it's under the /guess route. Now, after /guess, we're going to put in a name. So for example, /guess /Angela, and what it should give us is hey, and then the name that was entered into the URL. And then it should say, I think you are, and then the predicted gender from genderize.io. And then it should tell me how old it predicts that name to be. Now, this works for any name. So I could change it to James or Katie. And it doesn't really matter what I enter here. This piece of data come from these two APIs. Now, you might have to think back a little bit when we learned about how to use the requests module to get hold of the data that we want from an API. And then you're going to incorporate it into a website that you can design however you want, but be aware that the first line needs to have the name that was entered into the URL, and the name should ideally be capitalized into title case like this, and then it should have the predicted gender and the predicted age. So this is your challenge, and it might take you a little while to work out all the components, but I think you can do it. Pause the video and spend at least 15 or 20 minutes working out this challenge and see if you can complete it. Remember that you've always got the help of the documentation. So there's the Flask documentation, there's the Jinja documentation, and also there's the documentation from the Ageify and genderize.io. And if there's anything else, you can always search through the course for the part where we dealt with APIs and getting hold of data from APIs, as well as using Google and Stack Overflow to help you achieve this. Don't just give up if you get stuck. Try to work like a real-world developer and work out the solution to your problems. All right, so the first thing we have to do is set up this /guess /name route. Back inside our server, after where we've defined our home route, let's go ahead and create app.route, and here we're going to target /guess and then /name. Now, because we need to parse the URL to get hold of the name that the user entered, if we take a look at the Flask documentation, you might remember that yesterday we covered this idea of variable rules and parsing a URL. The way we do it is by adding some angle brackets around the part of the URL which is going to be taken in as a variable. And here's their example. So in our case, we're going to put this name part of the URL inside some angle brackets to turn it into a variable. And then we can create our function, which I'll just call guess. It doesn't really matter what you call it. And then inside this guess method, I'm going to put in this name. So essentially, when my guess function goes through this decorator method, it's going to give it a value for this name variable. And then I'm going to catch on to that name and I'm going to send it over when I render my template. So let's go ahead and create a new template to render. So it's going to be an HTML file, which I'll just call guess.html. And I'll leave the title as guess. Now inside the body, I want to be able to type the name. So it was hey and then the name. And then it was I think you are and then the gender. And then finally it was and maybe and your age. So something like this. Now we just need to replace the name, the gender and the age. So I'm going to keep those names and I'm just going to wrap them like this. Now, remembering the names of these variables, I'm going to go back to my server and I'm going to try and render my guess.html. So it was a render template. The name of the template is called guess.html. And then I'm going to add a bunch of keyword arguments. So the first one was the name. So this is the name of the keyword argument, and then the value is also going to be name because it's going to come from this URL. If you find that confusing, you can always change this. For example, we could change this to person name, and we could use that right here. Now you might be able to see that this name comes from the URL, which gets passed in through the input, and this person name is the one that we use when we put it into the template. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's comment out these two lines of code by hitting Command / or Control / and then hit save and run the code, and let's try going to this URL. So you can see it says hey, and then it says whatever it is that we typed after guess. So if we type a whole bunch of gobbledygook, then that's also what we're going to see right here. Now, one of the things about the name is it'll be nice to have it in title case. So we can change things to title case by using the Python title method, where we simply just say text.title. We can do that inside our guess.html because we know that we can evaluate Python expressions in between the double curly quotes. We can say person name dot title, and then it's the parentheses. So now if we save that, coming back over here, and we go back to our Katie and hit enter, you can see it's now capitalized, that K, and the first character is always now going to be capitalized. We've solved the first part. Now we need to figure out the gender and the age. And to do that, we're going to need the help of these two APIs, Genderize and Ageify. So the API is probably the simplest API you've worked with. You've worked with a lot more complex APIs in the past, so this shouldn't be too hard. Now, what we want to do is we want to replace this part that says Peter with whatever it is that the user typed into the URL right here. We're going to need to take this entire string and we're going to paste it in, and this is going to be the URL. Now we're going to replace this part by using an F string. So we have an F in front of the string, and then inside the curly braces we can put in the name which got passed from the URL. So that's the gender URL, and in order to get the data from that URL, we're going to need the requests library. So let's go ahead and import requests and install it if it's red and squiggly. Now, once it's installed, we can now use requests.get, and we can get hold of the data at this gender URL. And this is going to be our gender response. Now, from this gender response, we can get hold of the gender data, and we want it in JSON format. So we can say gender response.json. I'm not going to explain this too much because we've gone into excruciating detail before on how to work with JSONs, how to work with APIs, and how to work with the request library. I'm hoping that at this stage it's just a bit of revision and you just had to look up some of the methods, but you've already seen this before and it should be quite familiar. So now finally, from the gender data, we want to extract the part of that dictionary that is interesting, which is actually just the one under the key gender. So let's go ahead and add our square brackets and then put gender in here, and this is going to be equal to our gender. And that is what we're going to pass over. So we're going to say gender equals gender, and that means that once we get into the guess.html, it'll be able to put the value into this placeholder. Now all that's left is work out the age. So let's get our Ageify URL. And this is going to be pretty straightforward because it's going to be pretty much the same as what we did for the gender. And if you take a look at the JSON you get back from calling this API, the important piece of data is inside that key age. Now all we need to do is pass over a new variable called age, and the value is going to come from right here. So now if we hit save and we go back to our website and we hit enter, it should say, hey Katie, I think you're female and maybe 32 years old. Why is Katie younger than me? Anyways, I hope you managed to get that to work. If not, take a look at the final code in the course resources and see where you went wrong, and maybe revise the section in the course on APIs. In the previous lessons, we've seen how we can use the Jinja markup in order to insert bits of Python code into the HTML template. Now in this lesson, I want to demystify some of the other markup, like the curly brace percentage sign and some of these keywords. Now, what we've been able to do with this markup is to specify single line expressions in Python. But what if we wanted to create multi-line statements, like an if statement or a for loop? Well, we would have to use some slightly different markup. I'm going to go ahead and create a new HTML file, which I'll call blog. And this will have the title of blog. And in the body, what I want to do is to render all the titles of all the blogs I have. Now, in order to get hold of some data for our blogs, we're going to use a service called Endpoint. And this is a really neat service which just acts as a JSON storage bin. So basically, you can create your own API with your own JSON data, and you don't even have to log in. It's as simple as clicking on Create JSON bin, and then here you can create some keys, some values, or a list of values. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and access this bin at this particular API, and you can see it sends you that JSON back. So you can update anything in here, and you can get that data coming back to you via this API. That means that I could create some blog posts where each blog post has an ID, a title, a subtitle, and body, and I've only got 3 blog posts in my list, but you can now use this as if it were an API, simply by heading to this address, which you'll find in the course resources. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to pull down these blog posts as if it was an API, and we're going to try and display all of the titles and all of the subtitles. Inside our server.py, if we go ahead and set up a new app.route, and this route is going to be /blog, then here we're going to create a blog function, which is going to fetch all the blogs from this URL. So I'm going to copy the URL of my API, and you can do that in the course resources. And then we're going to put this as the blog URL. Now I'm going to use request.get to get hold of the data at that URL. And then I can tap into the data by saying response.json, and this will give me all of the blog posts. So we'll call that all posts. And now I'm going to render my blog.html, and I'm going to pass in all the posts under a keyword called posts, like this. So I've fetched all of those posts, I've passed it into a variable called all posts, and I'm sending that value over to the blog.html under the name posts. So now going to my blog.html, I should be able to catch that posts. And if we were just writing Python straight away, then we would be able to say something like for blog post in posts. Let's go ahead and create an H1 where we have the blog post title. And let's create a H2 where we have the blog post subtitle. And it would, in an ideal world, loop through all the posts it received, and for each of the blog posts, render an H1 for the title and H2 for the subtitle. Now, in fact, using Jinja, we can pretty much do exactly this, but we have to alter things a little bit. Firstly, when we have a multi-line statement, we're going to have to add a curly brace and then a percentage sign for each of the lines. So not just from the beginning to the end, but for each of the lines that's Python code that spans multi-lines, we have to enclose it inside this kind of markup. So notice the direction of the curly braces and also notice the presence of the percentage signs. Now, inside the part where we insert into HTML elements, we can do just as we did before, pass through the blog post and render it as a single line expression like this. But because we're working inside an HTML file, we also have to specify when our for loop actually ends. And that very end is also going to be enclosed inside one of these percentage curly brace. And there's a special keyword that comes from Jinja, which is called end for, in order to specify the end of the for loop. We'll just have to add it in like this. Now, if we go ahead and hit save, and now if we run our code and try to bring up our blog website, you should see that it's pulled in all of the articles in our fake blog, The Life of Cactus, Top 15 Things to Do When You're Bored, and Introduction to Intermittent Fasting. It's a really random blog that we're starting, and it's created an H1 for each of the titles and an H2 for each of the subtitles. And it's done this without us having to parse out each of the titles, subtitles. We've actually been able to do all of that just with a for loop inside our template. Now, you can do the same thing using an if statement. All you have to do is to again enclose every line in the statement with curly brace percentage sign, and then at the very end of your block of code of your statement, you have to add the end if keyword as well. See if you can modify this so that we only print out the title for the blog post, which has an ID of 2. All right, in this case, all we have to do is add an if statement down here. We're going to say if the blog post that we're currently looping on has an ID that's equal to 2, well, in that case, we actually want to render the title and subtitle, but otherwise we're not going to. All we have to do is add in the markup. So starting at the first if statement, we add the curly brace percentage sign at the beginning and at the end. And at the very end of the if statement, we add the curly brace percentage and that keyword end if to say that this is the end of the if statement. So now if we hit save and we go back to our blog, you can see that it's only going to show the second article, the one with ID of 2. So now that we've seen some of the things that we can do with templating in Jinja, I want to talk to you about something called URL building. And this is a way that allows us to direct the user to a specific page in our website and web app. Now, what that means is that, for example, on our main homepage, we could actually have a link to the blog's page. The way that we would do that is in our index.html here, we could create a anchor tag, for example, in the body here, and we could say go to blog, and then for the href of this anchor tag, this is where we're going to use the Jinja template to build out the href. So we're going to add the curly braces in and dynamically work out the href. And in every Jinja template, we have access to a method called URL for. So we can say URL for, and then because this is Python, we can add some parameters when we call this method. And what it's expecting is the name of a function in your Flask server. So you could, for example, hit up home or guests or blog. And in our case, this blog is what we want. So to make it a little bit more clear, because we've got the route, which is called /blog, and we've got the function, which is called blog, I'm going to change this to get blog. So want to render this blog page, we can call this method get blog by saying URL for and then pass in a string. So because we've got some quotation marks around the outside, we're going to use some single quotes on the inside. And in between the single quotes is the name of that method, get blog, like this. Now what it's going to do is it's going to generate a hyperlink that's going to be based on what it takes to get to this particular route and call this particular method. So now if I go ahead and update this and go to my home page here, you'll see there's a new link that says go to blog, and when I click on it, it takes me to the blog page. Now, another thing that you might want to do is when you navigate to a URL inside your web app, you might want to add in some parameters. You can add parameters when you're using URL4 in the same way that you did it when you did render templates. So you can create the name of the parameter and the value, and it's a keyword argument that comes after the first parameter. So here we could say, for example, URL4 get blog, and then we could just say a number equals 3. So now when the user clicks on this anchor tag, it's going to look for a method called getBlog on our server.py, which is right here. And then it's going to pass over any subsequent keyword arguments as parameters. So we can catch those parameters inside the app route. So we can say / and then we can use our angle brackets, which we've always done, to give parts of the URL a identifier. And we can call this num or number or whatever you like. And we'll also need to add that to the input to this method. And just to prove that it works, I'm going to print it out. So now let's go ahead and rerun our code. And if we go back to our home page and I click on go to blog, then it goes to the blog website and it inserts that 3 into that part of the URL. And if I take a look in the console, you can see it printed out that number, which got passed all the way from the index.html to the server. And finally, inside this method, it was caught and it could be printed. And it could also be further propagated into another template if need be. So now that we've done all the theory, in the next lesson, it's time to tackle the final project. And we're going to be building out our blog website with styling and also with templating. So for all of that and more, head over to the next lesson.